The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the overgrown property David was reclaiming. He'd bought this isolated land 6 months ago for its promised quiet. The old farmhouse needed work, its yard tangled with wild grass and branches. Today, he tackled the area near the collapsed storm cellar. Its rotted frame had collapsed into a shallow depression. David methodically pulled away debris. Then he heard faint scratching from below the ground, deliberate and rhythmic amid rustling leaves. He knelt by the cellar, pressing his ear to the ground. The sound came from beneath rotted wood and soil. Not random rodent noise. This was frantic clawing toward the surface. Something alive was trapped. David's heart raced. His palm on the dirt felt vibrations with each scratch. The persistent animal stirred David deeply. He considered calling for help, but couldn't ignore the desperate scratching. He had to help it survive. David grabbed his shovel and began digging, carefully removing soft, rotted wood debris. Beneath, hard-packed soil resisted. He dug slowly to avoid collapse as scratching grew frantic. Sweat soaked his shirt, shoulders burning. He paused often to confirm the weakening sound. Scratching persisted faintly, hands cramping and blistering. David pushed on, uncertain what awaited. His shovel struck something solid. Scratching stopped. He froze, fearing harm. Kneeling, he cleared dirt with trembling hands, revealing a small, muddy paw. David didn't She was becoming whole again. David's heart pounded as he brushed away the soil surrounding the tiny limb. The paw was matted with dirt, the fur so covered in grime he couldn't tell what color it was. He worked quickly but gently, terrified of causing more harm. The scratching had stopped completely now, and the silence was suffocating. He couldn't tell if the animal was unconscious or simply too exhausted to move. His fingers traced the outline of a small leg, then a shoulder. It was a puppy. David's throat tightened. He cleared more dirt, revealing the curve of a tiny ribcage rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. She was alive. Barely, but alive. He could see her now, curled in a tight ball in the small pocket of space she'd managed to claw out for herself. Her eyes were shut, her body trembling. David's hands shook as he widened the opening, speaking softly to her even though he didn't know if she could hear him. He told her she was going to be okay, that he was there, that she was safe now. The puppy's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. They were clouded with fear and exhaustion, but they focused on him. She didn't growl or snap. She just looked at him, as if trying to decide whether to trust this stranger who had broken through the darkness. David reached down slowly, his hand hovering near her head. She flinched but didn't pull away. He let her sniff his fingers, waiting. After a long moment, she stopped trembling. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was acceptance. She was too tired to fight. David slid his hands beneath her carefully, cradling her against his chest as he lifted her free from the hole. She was lighter than he expected, her body frail and underfed. Mud fell from her coat in clumps as he held her, and he could feel every bone beneath her skin. She let out a single, soft whimper and went still in his arms. David wrapped her in his jacket, holding her close to his body to keep her warm. He looked down at the hole she'd been trapped in and felt a wave of emotion crash over him. She'd been down there alone, in the dark, scratching at the earth with everything she had left. And somehow, against all odds, she'd survived long enough for him to hear her. David stood there for a moment, cradling the puppy against his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of her heartbeat through the fabric of his jacket. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Her tiny body was limp with exhaustion, but her breathing was steady. That was enough. He began walking toward his truck, each step careful and deliberate. The world around him seemed quieter now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The puppy's head rested against his arm, her eyes half closed, watching him with a wary, distant gaze. She was a German shepherd. He realized now that some of the dirt had fallen away. Her coat, beneath all the grime, would have been beautiful. But right now, she looked like she'd been through a war. Her paws were raw and bloodied from scratching at the earth, her nails worn down to nubs. David's chest ached at the sight. He reached his truck and opened the passenger door, laying out an old blanket he kept behind the seat. He placed her down gently, arranging the fabric around her like a nest. She didn't resist, didn't try to move. She just lay there, staring up at him with those big, tired eyes. David crouched beside the open door, his hand resting lightly on her side. He could feel her ribs expanding and contracting with each breath, and he silently willed her to hold on just a little longer. He didn't know how long she'd been trapped, didn't know how she'd ended up in that cellar in the first place. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting her home, getting her warm, and giving her a chance to recover. He closed the door softly and climbed into the driver's seat. The puppy didn't take her eyes off him as he started the engine. There was no panic, no attempt to flee, just that same exhausted, watchful stare. David pulled onto the dirt road, driving slowly to avoid jostling her. He glanced over every few seconds, checking to make sure she was still breathing. Each time, he found her looking back at him, as if she was trying to understand who he was and why he'd pulled her from the darkness. The drive back to the farmhouse felt longer than it should have. David kept one hand on the wheel and let the other rest on the seat near the puppy, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not so close that it would frighten her. She didn't move from where he'd placed her, her small body rising and falling with each shallow breath. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. David found himself talking to her, his voice low and steady, filling the quiet cab of the truck with words he hoped might bring her some comfort. He told her about the farmhouse, about the wide-open fields and the creek that ran along the back of the property. He told her she'd like it there, that it was safe, that she wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. He didn't know if she understood, but her ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice, and that felt like something. As they turned onto the long gravel driveway, David noticed the puppy's eyes beginning to droop. She was fighting to stay awake, her gaze flicking between him and the world passing by outside the window. He parked near the porch and turned off the engine, letting the truck settle into silence. For a moment, he just sat there, watching her. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet she'd survived something that should have killed her. That kind of will to live deserved to be honored. David reached over and gently stroked the top of her head, his fingers careful to avoid the cuts and scrapes that covered her body. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into his touch, just barely, as if some part of her remembered what kindness felt like. He scooped her up, blanket and all, and carried her inside. The farmhouse was warm, the fire he'd started that morning still crackling softly in the hearth. He laid her down on a thick rug near the fireplace, surrounding her with pillows to keep her comfortable. She watched him as he moved around the room, her eyes following his every step. David filled a shallow bowl with water and set it near her. She sniffed at it but didn't drink. He didn't push. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside her, close enough to let her know he wasn't going anywhere. The puppy's eyes finally closed, her body surrendering to the exhaustion that had been chasing her for who knows how long. David stayed there, his back against the couch, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if she'd wake up stronger or if her body would give out during the night. But for now, she was warm, she was safe, and she wasn't alone. David knew he needed to take her to a vet to make sure there were no internal injuries or infections he couldn't see. He called ahead, explaining the situation, and was told to bring her in that afternoon. The puppy was hesitant about the truck at first, her body going rigid when he tried to lift her into the cab. But when he climbed in beside her and rested his hand on her back, she relaxed. The vet's office was small and quiet, tucked away on the edge of town. The staff was kind, speaking in hushed tones and moving slowly around the puppy so as not to frighten her. David stayed by her side the entire time, his hand on her head as the vet examined her. The vet was a woman in her 50s with gentle hands and a calm demeanor. She worked carefully, checking the puppy's vitals, examining her paws, listening to her heart and lungs. When she finally stepped back, she looked at David with a mixture of sadness and admiration. She told him the puppy was roughly 4 months old, severely malnourished and dehydrated. Her paws would heal, but it would take time. There were no broken bones, no serious infections, but she'd been through significant trauma. The vet paused, then asked how long David thought she'd been trapped. He told her he didn't know. Days, maybe longer. The vet shook her head slowly. She said it was a miracle the puppy had survived it all. Most animals in that situation would have given up, but this one hadn't. She'd fought, and that fight had saved her life. David looked down at the puppy, who was staring up at him with those big, trusting eyes, and felt his chest tighten. The vet handed him a bag of antibiotics and special food, along with instructions for care. As they left, she stopped him at the door and told him he'd done something extraordinary, that the puppy wouldn't be alive if not for him. David didn't know what to say. He just nodded and carried her back to the truck. That night, as David sat by the fire with the puppy curled up beside him, he realized she needed a name. He'd been calling her girl and pup, but she deserved something more, something that honored what she'd survived. He thought about the sound he'd heard that day, the scratching that had echoed up from the earth, the sound that had led him to her. And he knew. Echo. He said the name out loud, testing it. The puppy's ears perked up, and she looked at him with those bright, intelligent eyes. Echo. It fit. Over the following weeks, Echo transformed. Her coat, once matted and dull, grew thick and glossy. Her ribs, which had been painfully visible, filled out as she gained weight. Her paws healed, and she began to run through the fields surrounding the farmhouse, her legs strong and sure. She was no longer the broken, terrified creature he'd pulled from the ground. She was vibrant, full of life, full of joy. But what struck David most was the bond they'd formed. Echo followed him everywhere, her presence a constant, comforting shadow. She slept beside his bed every night, her soft breathing a reminder that she was there, that she was safe. And every morning, without fail, she greeted him with pure, unfiltered happiness. her tail wagging so hard her entire body shook. David had never felt needed like this before, had never felt like someone's entire world. And in return, Echo had become his. He made her a promise, spoken out loud one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. He promised her she would never be alone again, that she would never have to fight for survival in the dark, that for as long as he lived, she would be loved, protected, and safe. Months passed, and life settled into a gentle rhythm. Echo was a part of everything now. She ran alongside David as he worked on the property, chased rabbits through the tall grass, and curled up beside him every evening as the fire crackled and the world outside grew quiet. She had scars, both visible and hidden, but they didn't define her. If anything, they were a testament to her strength, to the will that had kept her alive when everything else had tried to break her. David thought often about the day he'd heard her scratching, how easily he could have ignored it, dismissed it as nothing, how close he'd come to walking away. The thought haunted him and humbled him in equal measure. He'd saved her life, yes, but she'd saved his too. Before Echo, David had been drifting. He'd left the city to escape the noise, the pressure, the emptiness of a life that felt hollow. He'd thought isolation would bring him peace, but it had only brought him loneliness. Echo had changed that. She'd given him purpose, responsibility, companionship. She'd reminded him what it felt like to care about something beyond himself. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Echo resting her head on his lap, David looked out at the fields and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude for the land, for the quiet, for the sound that had led him to her, for the second chance they'd both been given. Echo shifted beside him, her eyes drifting closed as his hand stroked her ears. She was home, and so was he. They'd found each other in the darkness, two lost souls clawing their way toward the light, and together they'd made it through.